I didn't learn how to code until my late 20s, but within about 4 years of becoming a professional software developer, I landed a job at AWS. Now, looking back, I realized this journey could have been much smoother and probably faster if I knew then what I know now. Before you dive into coding though, you need to figure out what your goal is. Are you aiming to fully switch careers and become a full stack developer at a tech company? Or maybe you just want to automate some of the annoying tasks at your current job? There is also the option to become an automation test engineer, a front-end or back-end developer, a DevOps specialist, and more. But what if you don't know yet? What if you have no idea what those jobs actually entail? In that case, do some research. Watch YouTube videos that break down the day-to-day life of these roles, check out tech meetups in your area, and talk to people in the field. And most importantly, look at job boards for your location and make sure the pay aligns with the expectations for the role you might pursue. I got a bit lucky with my start. I earned a CompTIA A+ certificate to break into IT and landed a role at a local software company. At first, I felt pretty clueless. Honestly, that feeling lasted for days, maybe even weeks. But I was determined to learn at least a bit of coding to help me in my tech ops role. This mostly meant writing database queries using LINQ, which is a way to use C# instead of SQL. So SQL and C# became my first two technologies I focused on. But here's where things got tricky. As I started learning more about programming, I fell into the shiny object syndrome trap. Instead of staying laser focused on getting good at SQL and C#, I decided to dive into a front-end development course on FreeCodeCamp. I enjoyed it, and it gave me the basics to do some UI work, but I never got truly good at it. Then I made things worse by jumping from one programming language to another, switching frameworks whenever something got too hard or when I discovered a new tool that looked interesting. Instead of mastering one thing, I ended up being less than average at a few. And while there is a time and place for exploring different technologies without becoming proficient in any of them, it's definitely not the time to do that at the start of your journey, especially if you're starting later in life with family and other responsibilities. You might not have the luxury of wasting that time. Eventually, I got decent at both SQL and LINQ. I kept asking my manager for more work during downtime and inquired about what I needed to learn to move from tech ops to QA. Most of my motivation came from not wanting to be on the phone anymore. So my manager told me that knowing SQL and our products was enough, and that as a QA I could potentially make $50 to $60K a year. After making about $30,000 at the time, that sounded like a great deal. About 5 or 6 months later, I was offered a QA role without even an interview. It definitely annoyed some people. One person even stopped talking to me, but I was thrilled. No more phone calls, and I was making just over $40K to start with. But I knew more work lay ahead. That familiar feeling of not having a clue returned, but I was determined not to mess it up. Every night after work, I spent at least 2 hours, and often much more on the weekends, watching tutorials on C# and test automation. I had examples from developers who were writing testing scripts, and I could apply what I learned right away by modifying those scripts or writing new ones. But like before, it wasn't a perfect journey. I still jumped from one technology to another and found myself in tutorial hell, completing tutorials without feeling confident enough to apply what I'd learned. Instead of revisiting the material and trying to apply it, I just start a new tutorial. This not only wastes time, but also leaves you without something tangible to show to potential employers. As a beginner, building a portfolio is one of the best investments you can make. It doesn't have to be complicated, just make sure it works and the code is organized. And bonus points if you write tests. And remember, your first programming language doesn't really matter. If you want a challenge, start with Java or C#. It will make learning other languages much easier. If you want to start quickly though, just go with Python and don't overthink it. Whatever you choose though, stick with it until you're proficient and only switch if there is a solid reason to do that. The thing to split your time with early on is Git. In simple terms, Git tracks changes in files. Think of it like Google Docs version history. You can always revert to a previous version. Git works similarly, but for files in general. helping you revert changes if something breaks. Learning Git should take you about an hour and maybe even less. In my several years as a developer, I've only used a handful of Git commands regularly. Don't waste time searching for the perfect code editor or IDE, just use VS Code for now. It's easy to use, has tons of extension, and supports nearly any language you want to learn. I'm using VS Code to write Java at AWS. The only exception with this rule is if you're learning C#. Just use regular Visual Studio for that. Finding a mentor or at least 1 or 2 people to discuss problems with is also key. It helps with motivation and may speed up your learning. I missed this step, which could have sped up my journey, but luckily I had my old boss from TechOps. He eventually became the manager of the whole dev team, including QAs. One day he told me something that changed my life. You should apply to be a developer. At the time, I'd been a QA for just over a year and didn't feel ready to even consider becoming a developer. I told him that I'd rather be a good QA than a bad developer, to which he responded, "You won't let yourself be a bad developer." I thought about it and realized I had nothing to lose by trying. So I applied. My first interview was a disaster, but I applied again a couple of months later. Another bad interview. On the third try, I finally made it to the second part of the process where the whole dev team interviewed me. It was nerve-wracking. I don't think I fully messed it up, but the answer was still no. However, after seeing other candidates, they changed their mind, and given that I was already familiar with the code bases and the products, that decision is actually quite easy to make. The lesson here is twofold. First, always prepare for your interviews. I didn't fully understand what that looked like until I applied for a job at AWS years later. Second, keep a positive attitude, even after rejection. A few months later, another QA went through the same process. He didn't handle his rejection well though, and that attitude cost him a few more months before he became a developer. So soft skills matter. No one wants to work with somebody who is always grumpy and complaining about everything. Finally, consistency is king. Schedule at least 30 minutes every day and more if you can, and keep practicing. Don't give up if it feels like you'll never know everything. That feeling literally never goes away. Look up the definition of imposter syndrome. Those job postings listing 100 different technologies are looking for an ideal candidate that doesn't exist. Usually being familiar with about half of those skills can get you the job. And if I could sum up all of the things I've just talked about in one sentence, it would be this. Don't waste time, be consistent, and keep a positive attitude, even after rejections. And if you want to know the best 7 websites to start your programming journey, then watch this video.